All right, guys. Hey, welcome back. We have a special guest today in the studio, and a special studio. I'm actually up north in Orem, Utah right now with Dolf. And Dolf is a guy that is a master in real estate. I know a lot of you guys know that I've been in real estate for 7 years, but this is a guy that's been in real estate for 40 years.
That sounds horrid, but that's a long
But
time.
you've done over $3 billion worth of transactions in real estate. Did I get that right?
Yeah, I've been involved in that many, through my own investments, those with partners. Then we have private companies, public companies. It adds up over time.
It's crazy, though. And I joked off camera that if you want to do $3 billion in volume in real estate, you just have to have a really cool accent like Dolf. And then it's just going to happen magically. But I think this is going to be an awesome podcast. Thank you for coming on.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Let's jump right in. Let's talk about what it takes to be successful in real estate. I think a lot of my listeners listen for that reason. I think in Utah in general, which is where a lot of my listeners are, that real estate is an attractive thing. Utahns are very entrepreneurial. They love real estate. They love the idea of passive income. But I get so many people that talk to me on Instagram or social media and be like, where do I get started? How do I get started? I don't have a lot of money. Take us to when you got started 40 years ago. What was that like? How does somebody get started in real estate?
Well, firstly, I agree with you that real estate is very good. And the thing I love about real estate most is it's very forgiving of mistakes. Because when you look at most people who retire, not just here in the US, but in Canada and all over the Western world, when they retire, their biggest asset tends to be their home. And you can often hear them lament, oh my gosh, if only we bought a second home. If only we bought the neighbor's house when it came on the market. Remember, honey, we said to each other, that's an ugly house. Someone should buy it and paint it. We should have bought it and painted it and rented it out, right? So things go in cycles. The economy goes up, real estate goes up, the economy goes down. Like 2008, you remember the GFC, the global financial crisis. Properties came down so much, people said, I knew we shouldn't have bought property. No, that's the time you should be buying. So it's very forgiving. It hasn't changed much over 40 years. I ended up doing a PhD in electrical engineering, which is not the easiest thing around. But I mention that because everything I learned during that 8 years of study, everything has been made redundant by new technology. And it was 8 years of hard slog, 7 days a week, 11 hours a day. Whereas when it comes to real estate, you only need to learn about 8 terms. You need to know what equity is and what collateral is. And if you don't know the difference between equity and collateral, then you're at a slight disadvantage to someone who does. Yeah. But there are only about a dozen words like that. And real estate, in essence, is the same today as it was 40 years ago. So it's just so easy. It's so mindlessly, stupendously easy that I'm stunned more people don't get into it.
I love what you said, though, about when you're talking about people saying, like, I'll take my parents as an example. But I've heard them all growing up say, oh, I wish we would have bought more land, or I wish we would have bought the neighbor's house, or I wish we would have bought that. And now what I hear from my generation is, well, all that time, you used to be able to buy a house for $100,000. Like, that's gone. That's past. What do you say to people like that? Because in my mind, I'm like, that has nothing to do with anything. Like, it doesn't matter that they used to be 100,000. It's just going to go up from there. Do you agree? Do you disagree? What do you tell the generation now of, like, when they bring up that a house used to be $100,000?
Okay, the fact that it takes more units of currency in the U.S., more dollars to buy a house now.
Ooh,
you're
I
right,
like
it's
that.
Neither here nor there.
It just takes
However,
more units.
There is a claim to be made that it is tougher for today's young generation than it was for a young generation 40 years ago. Because when you look at the price of a house in terms of how many years of average salary you have to earn in order to buy a house, that has gone up. It used to be about 4 years worth of the average salary would buy you a home, and now it's like 11 years worth. Yeah. So it is tougher. But on the other hand, and this is the great thing about the States, the population is still increasing. Yeah. I sometimes mention Japan, and I love Japan. I love the culture and the food. I learned the language as a kid. But their population is in massive decline. Yeah. Currently 127 million, they think is going to drop to 80 million before long. That's good for getting rid of pollution. It's good for getting rid of congestion on streets. But it's atrocious for real estate values because it's dependent on supply and demand. And when your demand goes down, the price goes down.
Right.
So here in the States, we've still got a healthy population growth. Some of the reasons for that growth are disputed politically as to whether it's good or bad, but the net result up till today anyway has that been for the last decades our population has been growing steadily. That means that in addition to what we call the deflation of currency, right? A dollar is worth less today than it was before. So it takes more dollars to buy something now. That's just the value of money going down. But in addition to that, we've got demand inflation. There are more people looking to live somewhere than there were last year and 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And those two combine, which means prices will keep on going up. So I'm relatively optimistic about the long-term future.
Yeah.
Now, this current year, do we have a downturn looming? Do we have a downturn looming in the commercial space?
Yeah. What's your take on that?
Well, I believe there will be a massive downturn. And the real question is that good or bad? And here's a secret to answering any question I pose. The correct answer is always, it depends.
Yeah.
And in this case, it depends on, are you the owner of an existing commercial building that's going to go down in value? Or are you the potential buyer of a future commercial building that will go down in value and you can pick it up for a song? And there's no point buying a building, say, for $1 million that was worth $3 million last year if you can't figure out what to do with it.
Yeah.
But here's a little interesting insight, and I know we're jumping into it, but we've got no agenda
Let's jump.
anyway.
Yeah, I'm down.
Between residential and commercial, the value of a residential property is based, as you're well aware, on comps. If a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom home, 2 floors, certain size, certain age, certain conditions, certain views, certain vulnerability to the wind, if it sells for $483,000, then the house around the corner, up the street, down the road, similar size, similar age, similar is likely to sell for somewhere around that same price. It doesn't even matter whether it's tenanted or not. In fact, it might be slightly easier to sell if it's vacant, because if the buyer wants to live in it, they don't have to wait for the lease to expire.
Sure.
But when it comes to commercial real estate, and here's a fundamental difference, the value of a commercial property is literally a multiple of its rental income. In fact, technically, it's the rental income divided by the cap rate, where cap rate is short for capitalization rate. And in case you're bamboozled, or your listeners, by these terms, cap rate is one of those 12 words you need to learn along with equity and collateral. It's a capitalization rate. It is literally the rate at which you capitalize the rental income to arrive at the value of the property. Now, the significant thing is, if you and I can figure out a way of doubling the rent on that tenancy, we've doubled the value of the building.
Right.
It's got nothing to do with comps. The buildings around it might be vacant, worth almost nothing. Doesn't matter. It's a multiple of the rental income. You might say, well, is that even practical? Yeah, we do it all the time.
People do it all the time.
Yeah.
And we'll probably get into this. There's deals that you've done that have made you a ton of money, and probably other investors that were part of that a ton of money by you doing that very same thing. Am I right?
The very thing, because the truth is, most people, when they look at commercial real estate, they say, well, I can't buy something vacant, so I should buy something with a tenant in it. And right now in this current climate, market cap rates for commercial space, I know it varies depending on the city and the area, but they average at around 6%, 6 or 7%.
Yep.
So with mortgage rates at 7 or 8%, I don't know how
Just doesn't
anyone
make
can
sense.
afford to buy a property that's got a cap rate of 6%, is returning 6%.
Unless they're
The
just
mortgage
loaded
is
with a ton
costing
of
us-
cash and they don't know where to put it.
Well, but that's
And even
my
then-
competition.
Yeah.
My competition often with people with more money than need to make a profit.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I'll often look for and hunt down either vacant or semi-vacant buildings. Now, I don't go and buy them, because if I buy a vacant building, I have to pay the property tax and some insurance, and I'm losing money, right? But between me finding that vacant building and committing to buy it, I set about finding a tenant.
Mm-hmm.
So if I can find a tenant for an erstwhile vacant building, and I double the value, it's on the market at $1 million because it's vacant.
And you're under contract for it. Yeah,
Maybe
at the same
I've got
time.
an option on it, but I used to do that, but now I
Now
don't
you
even
just go
bother.
find one.
I feared that if my potential tenant found out that I didn't yet own the building, he'd buy it from under my nose.
Okay.
In 40 years, that's never happened. They don't want to buy it, or they don't have the money, or they don't think of it, even when I tell them. So I got to the point where I just tell them, hey, I don't own it, but I'd like to buy it, but I need a tenant. If you're willing to sign an LOI or a heads of agreement where, subject to me buying it, you will become the tenant, then I'm willing to have a crack at buying it.
Interesting.
So I can give you a real example. It involves a funeral parlor, which is not a very happy thing to think about, because what goes on inside a funeral home is, they poke hollow stainless steel tubes inside bodies to replace blood with formaldehyde and stuff that we don't want to think about, right? It's been vacant for 3 years. No one knew what to do with it. And so the price kept on coming down. Well, what I did is I employed someone at the then going hourly rate of $8 an hour to phone every funeral director going further and further away from the center to see if they're interested in operating there. And at the end of day 2, she found someone who said, I've always wanted to operate in that town. And that's when she put them on the phone with me. And I was honest. I said, listen, there's a vacant funeral parlor available for sale. If you want to buy it, get it. He said, no, I can't afford it. I don't want it. I need someone to buy the building for me. I said, well, go and have a look at it, see if you like it. If you like it, we might be able to do a deal. So he looked at it and called me and said, oh my gosh, it's perfect. I like it. I said, well, let's sign this heads of agreement where, if I buy it, then you become the tenant. He said, not so fast, Sonny Jim. I'll only do it if you give me a long-term lease. And so that's what I want,
That's
right?
what you want.
So one of my golden rules is never be the first to name a figure, because that person usually loses, right?
Yeah.
So I would have been happy with a 5-year lease. I thought that's a long time into the future. But instead of suggesting that, I said, well, how long a lease would you want?
Smart.
And he said, I won't do it unless you give me 10 years with a right of renewal for another 10 years. He signed up for 20 years.
Wow.
And so the building, in my eyes, but more importantly in the eyes of the bank, was worth way more than the then selling price based on it being vacant.
Right.
So when I got my mortgage from the bank, I think it was 66% or something, that paid for the purchase price except for the last $10,000. I only had to put $10,000 cash into this deal. I can't do that with residential. I can't find an empty house and find a tenant and suddenly the value doubles and the bank gives me nearly all the money I need to buy it.
Right.
Yeah, I just can't do that.
That's amazing. That's witchcraft.
It seems like witchcraft.
Yeah, but
it seems
but
like
it
magic.
happens all the time for people that are creative like you. I know a few other people that I've met in my life that have done similar things, and I can't think of a way in residential real estate that you can jump light years ahead like that.
Not light years. We do have techniques you can do, because maybe some of your listeners already have existing residential property. Here's an example I give just of being creative, right, of thinking differently. So for most people who become tenants, their biggest asset isn't their house, they're renting. Their biggest asset is their vehicle, their car. So if the house doesn't have a garage or doesn't have a carport, then their house is out. And like here in Utah, it's in the snow in the winter, and it's in the sleet and the rain and the sunshine and all that. So by building a carport, you can get more rent. Typically in America at the moment, you can get about $80 a month more by having a carport there. Well, $80 a month, if you work it out per year, that's roughly $1,000, right? And I can build a carport for $1,000. I don't know if you realize this, but a carport is just 4 posts, one in each corner, with a roof with a bit of a slope by the slope, so that when it rains, the water comes off.
Drains off.
If you're really cheap, you can get away with 3 posts. And more seriously, you can cantilever them by having 2 posts, but then it costs a bit more to make. But I can easily build a carport for $1,000. And then I collect $1,000 extra in rent. So if you've got an existing home, here's a way where once you've bought it, whatever return you're getting on it, you can invest $1,000 cash and get 100% return on that every year through extra rental. And as they say in the infomercials, but wait, there's more.
There's more.
Let's say we don't have $1,000 cash, or even if you do, my recommendation is you don't use your cash. Let's say we have the carport built. We haven't paid for it yet, but hold that thought. And we go back to the bank and say, Mr. Bank Manager, I now have a property that's generating $1,000 extra in rent. It's got to be worth more now, and they'll send their conservative appraiser in, and it'll be worth about $10,000 more. So we say to the bank manager, will you give me a modest 70% loan against this extra $10,000? And they say, sure, that's what they do, right? They accept depositors' funds at an extraordinarily and ridiculously low interest rate and then lend it out to you and I for purchasing real estate at a much higher rate. So we get this loan of, say, 70% of $10,000, that's $7,000. And let's say the interest rate is ridiculously high, 10%. You therefore have a choice of paying $1,000 cash for this carport and getting $1,000 a year return, 100%, or paying nothing for it. You get a loan of $7,000 from the bank. You use $1,000 of that $7,000 to pay for it. So we've now paid for the carport. We've now got $6,000 cash. We're paying $700, 10% of the $7,000 interest, but we're still collecting $1,000. So we've still got $300 profit a year. But now we've got $6,000 in our pocket. And ask yourself the following question. Is it earned income? No. It's not a salary,
right.
So there's no income tax on it. Did we sell something? No. No capital gains tax? No. It's tax-free money with the government's approval and the bank's approval that you can do with what you want. And if you're thinking, or if your listeners are thinking, well, $6,000 isn't that? What if you had 10 of these houses and you got $60,000?
Right.
Or you want to do it on a bigger scale? So it's just a matter of thinking outside of the box. What can we do differently to increase the value of this property?
That's awesome. And I want to bring up this point because back earlier in this podcast, you said, I do think it's a little bit more difficult than it was years ago. But the thought that hit me now as you're saying this, and then is in some ways that's good because then it separates you.
Indeed.
If you can figure out what Dolf is saying right now, where you can leverage money and get creative, there's a lot of people that won't go down that rabbit hole. And so now you're this one of few people playing in this wide world of real estate with tons of opportunities all around you, and you don't have a lot of competition. Would you agree?
I fully agree. I'd go one step further.
I see that all the time.
Yeah.
Go one step further. Go ahead.
There are so many rules and regulations that you have to conform to. Setback ratios when you go more than one story high, that you've got recession planes so that the sun can still shine on the neighbors' properties for this many hours a day. And it just gets really complex. Well, that keeps your competition at bay.
Right.
They don't have the perseverance.
Because they're just going to give up.
Yeah. And it's not that tough to learn.
Yeah. There's a barrier to entry, a natural barrier to entry.
Right.
That is going to reduce your competition. So what you're talking about, leverage, let's talk about let's talk about HELOCs. Let's talk about cash out refinance.
Okay.
Your opinion on those, because it's another form of leverage. If I buy a property, if I buy a rental, let's say, and that property over COVID, I now have $200,000 of equity that I don't know what to do with, and rates are still at 3.5%, and it makes a ton of sense. Well, yeah, of course I'm going to probably cash out, refinance, get a lower rate, and now I have, let's say I pull out $150,000 to go and play with. That's different than going, I see a lot of people nowadays going and getting a HELOC, which is different because it's a variable rate. When should you use a HELOC to leverage, and when should you use a cash out refinance?
Okay, that's a tough question because the truthful answer is you should use a HELOC when interest rates are coming down, because then it's variable, it's going to come down. The honest truth is we don't know when interest rates are going to come down.
Right.
I love the idea of a HELOC when they work, when interest rates do come down, but there is a chance that interest rates will go up. And I'll give you an example. When I got started, I was paying, and most listeners won't believe it, they'll think, no, that can't be true, but I was paying 21% interest. I had one mortgage at 24% interest. And while everyone was saying, well, I'm not going to participate in that market, that's crazy, I relished it. I didn't relish the fact that I was paying that much money, but I relished the fact that the market had such a big anomaly in it because it kept my competition at bay. It's another version of what you just said. It keeps everyone out. And I knew that in all probability, interest rates wouldn't continue going up the way they said they did in Argentina or Israel. They went up to 1,000% overnight in those countries. But that in all probability, they'd come down, and they did. Within a year, they were down at 16%. A year later, they were at 12%, and they were on a sort of slippery slide since then. And what happened to the value of real estate as those interest rates came down? It shot up through the roof.
Right.
So, there's a great book by Nassim Taleb. He's a Lebanese writer. He's written many books, but one of them is called The Black Swan. And he talks about a black swan being something unexpected, because until 1869, the world knew that all swans were white. It was just a quirk of nature. And then these people exploring the outbacks of Australia on camelback, ironically, came across these black swans, and it scrambled the scientific world's mind because it seems there are black swans. So he uses that as an analogy to say a black swan is any event that you expect not to happen, and then it does happen. Or it could be an event that you do expect to happen, and then unexpectedly it doesn't happen. So he says the secret in life is not to try and avoid black swans, not to try and avoid that earthquake or that lightning bolt or that economy blow, but to kind of depend on them, just expect them, and then have strategies to take care of them, because the economy is never going to be linear and steady and smooth. It always overshoots and undershoots, and in any aspect of the economy, real estate in particular. And as you go through the years, you realize that things repeat themselves. I'll never forget, Eric, a time in Sydney, Australia, when I was walking through the CBD, and there was a sign on just about every commercial building. I'm saying 9 out of 10 had either a for lease sign on it, or a for sale sign, or a for lease or sale. They were so desperate for money, they didn't care if they got a tenant or sold it. They couldn't pay the obligations anymore. And everyone said to me, because I was running an event on commercial real estate, a 2-day event, and they said, how can you, with a clear conscience, teach people about the merits of commercial real estate when it's pretty darn obvious that this whole thing is collapsing? And I think in their mind, because we tend to have really short memories, in their mind it was collapsing until the end of eternity.
Right.
Whereas in my mind it was part of a cycle. And you don't want to buy it while it's still on the way down. You don't want to buy something like, I heard of a building in San Francisco. It sold 4 years ago for $160 million. It just transacted in December, so at this stage 2 months ago, for $39 million. You don't want to spend $39 million on something, notwithstanding that it cost $160 before, if it's going to go down to $20 million and you're forced to sell. But at some point we're going to reach the bottom, especially in this country with having a growing population. I know the demand for office space is going down because people are still working from home. But guess what? They're turning some office floors into pickleball courts.
Yeah.
I never played pickleball as a kid. We used to play.
Did you know I used to play professional pickleball? You probably didn't know
No,
that.
how
You
long
just met
ago?
me today. I quit about 3 years ago because I have 4 kids now, and I'm running
Wow.
multiple businesses,
Well,
and so it's
congratulations
hard.
on the 4 kids.
But it's so funny that you say that because, yeah, they're popping up all over, and that's also another part of my world is pickleball.
That's so cool. When did it start? When did you start playing pickleball?
I started playing 10 years ago.
Okay, so
Which is-
prior to that, it was almost unheard of.
It
Would you
was. And surprisingly, it actually got started, 40, 50 years ago. But it was very small.
agree? I
But even
never
10 years
heard of
ago.
it until
Oh,
about
yeah.
4 or 5 years ago.
And now everybody loves it.
Now, in my day, we played squash. You
Yeah.
ever played that?
I've never played, but I used to play racquetball. And
Okay, well,
everybody used to
similar.
say, you got to play squash.
Yeah, and you've seen it. So you need a big
I've seen it.
custom-made court. You have to have a specially built building.
Mm-hmm.
There are very few tennis courts inside because they require so much. Most of them are outside. I know there are indoor courts. But with the advent of pickleball, which you know more about than I realized, you can retrofit them into floor spaces of commercial buildings.
Way easier.
We've got so many alternative uses for commercial building. I don't think that oversupply that we have at the moment is going to last for the next 300 years.
Right.
There's going to be a time where some podcast interviewer is going to interview some real estate person and say, well, wasn't this predictable that there'd be a massive demand of commercial space and that there is a 100 million square foot shortage of commercial space, the way right now we've got 4.1 million shortage of residential homes.
Yeah.
And people will shake their heads that no one took advantage of it.
Right. I've seen that with my parents and all the stories they talk about. My parents are retired comfortably. They're not going on lavish vacations or anything like that, but they're good. They're set through real estate.
Right.
And so hearing all of their stories, I've picked up some of that, and that's one of the reasons I decided to get into real estate 7 years ago. And I have people ask me all the time too, though, and I want to ask you this question. Now where we're at today, let's talk about Western United States, but specifically Utah, because we're in a lot, if we can. You mentioned that you don't think that it's at the bottom. You don't think that we've hit the bottom. Is that correct? I don't want to put words in your mouth.
I don't know if we're near the bottom or not.
Your gut tells you what?
That we are near the bottom.
That we are near the
There's
bottom.
going to be a turnaround.
There's going to be a turnaround up in value.
There always is.
Interest rates are going to have a big deal to do with. Are we on the same page there? If real
Right.
estate, rates go down from the residential price that we have right now, of like 6.5%, 7%. Let's say they go down to 5%. We don't know what the magic number is, but 5%. There could be a massive turnaround.
Correct.
In residential.
Right.
At what point do people quit listening to this fear of what if it goes up? What if it goes down? When do I buy? When do I get in the game? How do they get past the fear? The mindset of, well, what's going to happen? You touched on it a little bit, but let's go deeper into that because there's so many people that don't do anything that I see, and in a way they get screwed. If people would have bought that, I know 5 years ago, if they would have bought a piece of real estate, a young family, you talked about one house can change your life. And that I totally believe in that. That one house 5 years ago would have changed their life. They would have made a few $100,000 probably with COVID in Utah. Let's talk about that if we can. Let's talk about how to get past the fear.
Some people can't because they live with others who also share that fear. And we become the average of the 5 people that we hang with most. You've heard that before. So if you have a couple of family members and a couple of close friends and this avuncular figure, and they all talk fear every day, constantly, and they pre-select the articles that support their fear-mongering, then they are going to convince you that you shouldn't do anything. In fact, why don't you give your money to this investment advisor? After all, he does that for a full-time living. And what they don't realize is that many investment advisors, not all, I don't want to brandish them all with this, but they earn a commission when you put money in, when you switch over to a different class of asset, when you pull money out. They've got exit commissions and trailing commissions, and they don't really care what happens. They just sometimes they'll call you to say, I think we should switch from this to that because they're short of cash. That's not a very good motivation for coming up with advice, even if it's at a subconscious level.
Sure.
So I don't know if we'll convince everyone. And the truth is, I don't know if my predictions are right. I mean, I always tell people, they ask me, do I have a crystal ball? And I do. And it's a brilliant crystal ball. But unfortunately, history has shown it to be no more accurate than anyone else's crystal ball. Yeah. There is talk right now that we have pumped $29 trillion into this economy. It's the biggest increase, percentage-wise, in the history of our country. And that it's not sustainable, that it's more dollars chasing the same number of goods, and therefore there's going to be a massive crash that's going to dwarf the other crashes. Many people are stating that. And maybe they're right. I don't know. They're saying you should sell everything you've got right now and be cashed up. Maybe they're right. But I've heard that so often in the last 20 years, and I didn't take that advice, and I'm kind of pleased I didn't. Even with the GFC of 2008, 2009, some of my holdings are in Arizona, and they came down probably the largest percentage downturn that was measured in the country. Like some properties came down 80%. That's pretty bad. That means I had properties there that went below the value of the mortgage on them. And many people just handed the keys back to the bank. Ironically, with such a downturn on the residential side, people still had to live somewhere, so rents didn't come down nearly that much. And my rent still enabled me to pay the mortgage, so I kept them. And it took about 7 years for things to come on par again now, but currently the values of those properties is about 3 times what they were prior to the crash of 2008. So sometimes it's just a matter of hanging on.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, could I be shown to be wrong in 3 years' time? It's very possible.
All of us could. But I think I try to learn from as many people like you that have been in the game as possible. And I don't know the answer either. We don't have a crystal ball. But as I look at it, there seems to be one thing that's true. Even though people sometimes lose in the market, there's a black swan that comes up that we can't predict or we couldn't. Mm-hmm. You try to do the best that you can at playing the game and getting in the game because you learn something.
Right.
You gain value as a human being.
Right.
And if that happens, then you're going to be better prepared for the next time. It's not the end of the world. It's not the end of your life. And usually it's sometimes, I mean, I know people that have lost millions of dollars and bounced back millions of dollars higher. But it sure sucked at the time. But it's not the end of the world. And I look at it and go, just taking a leap of faith and going and buying a $400,000, $500,000 rental to try to do your best to be able to set yourself up for the future, why not? It's really not that much money at the end of the day. It's not enough to where you can't bounce back. You can't be entrepreneurial. You can't find a way. I find more people win by taking a leap and taking a chance and trying to vet their numbers and ask the questions and get solid and over a 30-year interest rate and the numbers pencil and all that set up than those that never take the leap.
Well, that's very true. I mean, I've got an image of a person who waited for the perfect time to buy real estate, and it's the image of a skeleton covered in cobwebs, right?
With no real estate.
In addition to that, I agree with what you said, but that's if you just took the average of real estate, the average prices, the average increase. The thing I absolutely love about real estate is it's so easy to beat the average in a way that I personally haven't figured out how I can beat the average in the stock market or in futures or options or treasury bills or certificates of deposit. How do you beat the average in those things? How do you beat the average in the stock market? Everyone tries. Mutual fund managers try. Yeah. And guess what? 50% of them succeed. The other 50% don't. That's how you get the average, right? I have not seen a credible formula for how to beat the stock market long term. But I've got a credible formula for beating the real estate market long term. I'm happy to share it now.
Love to hear it.
And I've got 18 different ways, but I'll give you one now. There's a strong correlation, we've already touched on it, between population growth and the increase in real estate values. So why are real estate values coming down in Japan? For the most part, because the population's in decline. So we have an average growth rate in the States, depending on which, case shiller or whatever you use, but it's around 7% or something. But that's the average growth of real estate long term. But that includes defunct old podunk towns that have had their only industry collapse. And if you pick a region that has higher than average growth, you should do better than average. So Phoenix as a city, it's been the number one for growth in this country by most measures for the last 50 years, not the last 50 minutes, the way stock market trenders watch what's happening and buy this, sell that. So, it's now the 5th largest city in the country. I read this morning, ironically, that 200 people move into Phoenix every day. That's 6,000 a month. That's 72,000 a year. That's 72,000 people that need podiatrists and gerontologists and tire repair places. And it's fueling the growth of housing demand there and commercial stock demand. Now, that's if you pick Phoenix over anywhere at random in there. You can beat the national average. But there are suburbs within Phoenix that do better than the Phoenix average.
Yeah.
It takes you a long time, about 20 minutes or so, to figure out which of those subjects are. You call any agent, they all know.
Yeah.
Right? Scottsdale and Paradise Valley do better than
Mesa and Gilbert.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Within suburbs, there are clusters of streets that do better. Proximity to the cool
Sure.
restaurants or access to freeway or whatever it is. So one way is just through population growth. There's another way. If you'll find anywhere in the world, if you buy a piece of real estate by a large body of water, a lake or a river or the ocean, they tend to go up in value faster than a similar piece of real estate, not by such a body of water. It's just the way. I mean, I can explain why. You get a view, you can't be built
Sure.
out, you go swimming or kiting or whatever. Then there's another one. The population here is increasing, as we've already agreed, but the proportion of elderly is increasing at an even higher rate than the population at large. That means the demand for 55-plus communities, Alzheimer's care, dementia care, elderly care, rest homes, assisted living facilities, all those things is going to grow faster than
And
the
they're
population.
popping up all over in my town, St.
Well,
George.
of course they are,
Like
because
crazy.
the proportion is increasing, right?
Yep.
So that's if we take any one of these independently. What if we were to combine them? So
Right.
I lived in La Jolla for a while.
Oh, cool.
La Jolla is, one of the nicest suburbs of the San Diego area. In fact, it's one of the top 12 suburbs in the country. And most people, if they've been to La Jolla, they've been to the seal colony. That's where these wild seals come up onto this little curvy beach to bathe in the light, to warm up and rest or whatever. And they're wild. There are big signs, don't get close to them, the wild animals. Most people go there and check it out. But when you walk back from that beach, there's a little archway out in the ocean. I don't know what you call it, a breaker or something. You can walk on it. And you climb back up the hill to the road and cross the road. There is an assisted living facility there. So ask yourself the following question. Is it in a higher than average growth part of the country? Yes, La Jolla is one of the top 12 in the country. Does it cater to the elderly? Yes, it's an assisted living facility. Is it by a large body of water? You're probably the largest one in the world, the Pacific Ocean. Do we think that that assisted living facility is going to go up in value faster than the average of the United States? Yes, you can bet your bottom dollar on it.
Pretty darn good chance.
And you can do this with real estate. You can't do it in any other area.
Yeah.
If you get insider information on a company and you use that information to make decisions on buying or selling stock and you're caught, that's called insider trading. You go to jail.
Yeah.
If
Fraud,
you go
right?
to a council meeting, a city meeting, whatever you call it, we call them city councils, and you listen to hear which road is going to have its designation, its zoning changed from residential to light commercial, and you take that information and you buy houses and you turn the tenancy of that house from a residential house into a hair salon or an accounting office or a dental practice or something, and you double the rental and double. That's not insider trading.
Right.
You don't have to sneak into that council meeting. You can just
So
turn
good.
up and show who you are.
So
you
good.
can send someone else to go on your behalf. You can watch it live online. You can get the notes from someone. You can act on it. I don't understand why more people don't get excited. I'm getting excited now, but I'll try and tone it down.
Yeah, no, it's great.
But
I love it.
It's all good, It's
I
kinda
love
great.
it. It's fun to have somebody get so excited about real estate, because a lot of times in my circle, I'm the one trying to get excited for other people to get into it. And they're just like, yeah, but when they spread a bunch of fear,
Right,
So
right.
it's fun to be able to jam with you on that. One of the things we mentioned, we got to cover it. $20 to $2 million. Is that
Yeah,
what you said earlier?
overnight, yeah.
Overnight. All right. We have to go through that because I've never heard that before. You have to support your outlandish claim. How did you go from $20
Well, I'm
to
pleased we
$2
covered a few more modest ones, like the carport. That's an easy one to think of, imagine. Sometimes by painting a house, you can increase the value beyond the cost of painting it. I don't know what it costs to paint a house these days. I'm guessing $2,000. If you get a bunch of people to do it for you, you can do it yourself. And if you've never painted yourself into a $20,000 profit for a weekend by spending $2,000 on the paint and doing it yourself and then seeing the value go up, then maybe people should think about doing that. And the reason why that works is when people see an unpainted house, they think, well, that's in bad condition. I bet the wiring's shot, the plumbing leaks, the roof leaks. Who would buy that? And yet when you paint it, they drive by that same house and say, wow, look how sparkling it is. I bet the electric's good, the wiring and the plumbing's good. And
Right.
there's no correlation between those two,
Right.
but they think that, right? So it's all at a subconscious level. So most people accept that a $2,000 paint
It's
job
just
might
lipstick
increase
on
it.
a pig. Yeah. You don't
And
know.
I admit,
Yeah.
20 to 2 million is out there. So let me start by telling you what the money was spent, right? The $20. It was spent on a bucket of white paint and a brush. So that's easy so far. But how do we go from that to 2 million? Well, I have to set the scene. It happened in Jakarta, which is the capital of Indonesia.
Okay.
They're thinking of relocating the capital, actually, because it's sinking by about 10 centimeters, whatever that is, 3 inches a year. But it is also known as being the most congested city on this planet. You measure how far it is to go to your destination, not in terms of kilometers or miles, but in terms of hours. Oh, you have to go to that office? That'll be 3 hours. That'll be 4 hours. So the drive from the CBD, where we had the client, to the airport should take about 45 minutes. But because of traffic, you don't know whether it's going to take 3 hours or 5 hours. So that means if one of our lessees, one of the tenants, if the CEO of the company had a board meeting at 9 a.m., he couldn't book a 1 p.m. flight because he may not make it. So what do we do with this bucket of paint and the brush? Went onto the roof of this commercial building. It was a flat concrete roof, painted a big white circle, and then in the middle we painted the letter H, and we turned it into a helipad. And full disclosure, we had to get Civil Aviation Authority, which is their version of the FAA, approval to land there, and that involved dinners and promises of helicopter rides and paperwork and all that. But once we got the approval, you could now get to the airport in 15 minutes. And about half the tenants figured they'd probably make use of that, so it was worth an increase in rent. The other half knew they probably would never make use of it, but they had bragging rights. Their building had a helipad on the roof, right? Yeah. So the rental, when you convert it from their local currency, rupiah, about 14,500 rupiah per dollar. So everyone in Indonesia is a billionaire, by the way, but when you convert it from rupiahs per square meter to US dollars per foot, the rent went from about $14 a foot to $16 a foot. That's a $2 lift in rental. Over 100,000 square feet. That means the annual rent went up by 200,000 a year. And at a cap rate of 10%, but higher in Indonesia, at 10%, the value of the building went up by 2 million.
Yeah.
Overnight.
Wow.
And that's why
by painting a circle on a roof.
A circle on a roof.
That is a wild story. I have never heard anything like that before, but that is incredible. How did you even think about that? Where did that thought even come from? Was it just that you saw the problem and you're like, hey, I mean, how did you get there?
You know, two factors came in. Firstly, I'm a big advocate of travel. I think we should travel more. Travel broadens the mind. As someone greater than me said, we don't travel the world to discover new places. We travel the world to discover our own home. And you get ideas from other places. And you're, dang, that's so brilliant. Why don't we do that here? I mean, I can give you one that your listeners will be familiar with. Here in America, it is legal when you come to a red traffic light. It's illegal to turn against the light, right, against red. If you're going around the corner, you have to officially come to a stop and make sure there's no traffic and it's safe. I have only seen that being legal in North America, so the US and Canada. Anywhere else in the world, it's not permitted. I admit when I first came here, I thought, man, I bet that causes a lot of accidents. I haven't seen a single one caused by that. So that's an example of where what we do in America is really good. I can give you other examples of where what happens in America I think is weird. And they're neither here nor there in the scheme of things. But when it comes to real estate, if you can get ideas from other countries and bring them back home, it can make you a fortune. So I saw lots of helicopters being used in other places. And then I've been blessed to work with helicopters a bit. I had one in Phoenix for a while. We would go around all our projects by helicopter.
That's cool.
And yeah, we built some water ski lakes out in the desert, and it was an hour to drive there. We'd spend an hour there, an hour coming back. You could only take 2 groups in a day, whereas with a helicopter, you could take like 10 per day or something. Plus, most people had never been in a helicopter.
Right.
So for them, the thrill of
experience.
Getting a ride sort of, I think, influenced their decision as to whether to invest with us or not. I actually stopped doing it when I saw something on the internet that, hey, want a free helicopter ride? Pretend you're interested in one of Dolf's projects. So we stopped that. So that's, I think, what spawned the idea of doing it in Jakarta. And it was a matter of, getting authority. Most cities in the U.S., like here in Salt Lake City or St. George, I don't know if the city would allow us to put a helipad on the roof of a random building. But they have various there, like embassies tend to have them in Indonesia. And there's a whole background reasoning for that sort of thing. And so it wasn't such a way out idea.
But you didn't live there.
No.
You traveled there, you visited there, you had experience other places. But what made you think that, hey, I can get past the city and the government, whatever it works, however, I wouldn't even know how it works there.
I didn't know either.
But you're just like, let's go.
Let's go. You've
ready, fire, aim. Like, just go for it.
Yeah. No, but you have to do that.
Yeah.
And I think many people lead lives that are too regimented. Like before they'll go on a trip, they'll make sure they have their passport and that there's 6 months of life left on it when they expect to come back home. And then they'll book all their hotels 6 months in advance. And when you book your hotel 6 months in advance, you've got no flexibility as to, something that might come up. So I think people need to live with a bit more uncertainty. In fact, Tony says it well, Tony Robbins, he says, the quality of your life is in direct proportion of the amount of uncertainty that you can comfortably live with. So if you need everything to be figured out months beforehand, you'll never go and talk to someone about putting a helipad on a roof.
Right.
And by the way, do all these ideas work? No, you're getting, 40 years worth of the few things that worked. You're not hearing. We don't have time to talk about the 10,000 things that didn't work.
But what I'm hearing is something different. I want to bring that out. And we kind of touched on it just a little bit, but it's the fear thing. You're not afraid to shoot. And I think that's important for people to hear. You're not afraid to take your shot.
Right.
And you took a lot of shots.
Yeah, a lot.
Some of them hit, and some of them were bullseyes,
Yeah.
and some of them weren't. But you didn't care.
Yeah.
At least it doesn't appear to be that way. And you learned something. One of my favorite F words is feedback. It's feedback. Yeah. It's not a loss. It's not losing. It's just feedback. You take a shot and you got feedback. I'm not a huge gun guy, but my father-in-law is a big gun guy. And he's taken me on 2 shooting competitions, and they were fun. And one of the things that I learned from going and shooting in a competition is that you get a shot or a couple shots to be able to sight in your scope. Mm-hmm. And if you think about real estate that way, I love this analogy, that when you take a shot, you just want to hit anywhere on the board. Because if you can hit anywhere on the board, you have feedback. Now you can adjust your scope. You have the elevation, which is your up and down. You have your windage, which is left and right. And so you can, they're called MOAs, but for the short, you do a couple clicks this way or a couple clicks that way on the top, and you can sight it in to where if you have a sled and that gun is not moving, you're going to hit the bullseye every single time. But if people never shoot their shot, where's the feedback to know where they even are on the board?
It's so true.
They have no idea.
Yeah.
And that's and you don't have fear to do that. And that's what I want to bring out.
Yeah. And that's why I not only don't mind going to a strange country that I've never been to, and that gets harder to do, by the way, as you go to more and more countries, where I don't speak the language, and I'm blessed I picked up a few as a kid. Everyone does in Europe, so it's no big deal. But you go to a place where you've never been, where you don't speak the language. Most people freak out. And they just want to eat at a McDonald's because they're pretty sure what they'll get, and drink at Starbucks and eat at a hotel whose brand they're aware of. And I love going somewhere where I don't even know what the signs say. Now, do you have to be careful? Of course, there are horrible stories about people who don't come back. But you've got to try these things. So you bring up an interesting point, because one is to just be willing to take a shot, right, to get started. But the other thing is, what we often do is we go and see people who already have existing properties, an existing portfolio, and we figure out for them what can we do to increase the value. So to use an example, 2 examples we've already covered. If they've got a residential home without a garage or a carport, I'll talk about the merits and figure it out. What do houses in this area rent for that do have a carport? And then what do they rent for that don't? And is it worth spending the $1,000 building one? And sure as anything, I'll try and figure out if it's worth putting a helipad on the building. Now, I've only done that once in my life, but we did it in another location too, not on a commercial building, but at a farm, where we ordered a concrete truck to come and deliver a load of concrete. And he duly knocked on the door. I happened to be there, and he said, "Where do you want the concrete?" And the wife said, "Over in that little hollow there." And he said, somewhat lacking in PC-ness, political correctness, he said, "Is your husband here? Can I see him?" And he was there laughing. "Yes, that's where we want it." So we put the concrete there and spread it out, made it flat, and painted the white circle on it. Now, you could argue you could land a helicopter in that paddock without the concrete there. It's true. But for the whatever it cost, that load of concrete, $4,000 or something, we now had officially a helipad on this property. And I think the value went up by way more than the $4,000 cost.
Yeah.
So it's just a matter of figuring out so I only used that twice, but there are other things that you can do. I don't know how many carports I put in or inspired other people to put in, because it's just a great idea. Or if there's an existing carport, close in one side of it so it doesn't catch the setting sun, so your car doesn't heat up in the afternoon. And once you've done one side, see if you can get city code approval to close the whole thing in.
Yeah.
And then turn the garage into a sleep out, or whatever it's called, a sleep in, or maybe, and then put another carport out the front of it.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of what can you do that's reasonable, that can increase the value.
It's so good, and it's so simple, because you keep saying, and I hear this all the time, right? But I just want to bring this out, is you're just increasing the value. Well, let's talk about the word value. Value for who? People. Like the real asset is people.
What about the
without
value
people?
for everyone?
Yeah, everyone, people, or everyone.
So the bank, the tenant, you, and
Sure.
Let me give you an example. I had a
Everyone
residential
involved.
property, 3 bedrooms. The tenants had been there for 5 years, never had skipped a rental payment. The lease came up for renewal, and the guy, the father came to me and he said, Dolf, I'm sorry, we're not going to renew. Now, as I ask people, what do you normally say when someone says they're not going to renew? I could have said, well, I'm sorry to hear that for me, but I'm happy for you, whatever's happening. You've been such a great tenant. If you want a referral, I am happy to write you an accurate but very good referral because you've been great. I didn't say that. I said, if you don't mind me asking, why are you leaving? And he said, well, the truth is my wife is pregnant and we need a house with an extra bedroom. And I said, just a question for you. If I were to build you an extra bedroom here, would you consider staying? And he said, oh my gosh, we wouldn't have to change schools for the kids. We wouldn't have to change our address. It wouldn't be a disruption. Wouldn't need to take a week off work. He said, absolutely. So people then ask me, are you crazy? You just build an extra bedroom because he got his wife pregnant? Well, no, let's think of it. The rental on the property with the 3 bedrooms was whatever it was at the time, 1,200. The rental on a 4-bedroom was 600. That's 400 a month extra. What is that per year? Well, most people should be able to work it out here. 4,800. So call it 5,000 a year, right? So I would be collecting 5,000 a year extra in rent. And let's say interest rates are 10%. They're not, right? Back then they were like 5%, but let's say they're 10%. How much extra mortgage could I afford to pay if I was collecting 5,000 a year at 10% interest? Well, I could borrow 50,000. So the equation for me became, can I build an extra bedroom for less than $50,000?
Right.
And I got the quote, and it was 33,000. So by building this extra bedroom, I employed all the contractors, the electricians, the carpenters, the plumbers, you name it. It cost me $33,000. I was collecting an extra $5,000. I was making a cash flow profit. My equity went up. My net worth went up. My cash flow went up. And most importantly, my tenant appreciation went up. That's why I say everyone wins. The bank got an extra loan that they were having service. Right. The tenant won, I won. And you can bet your bottom dollar that if this guy had a colleague at work and said, I need to rent a place. Do you know of it? He would have said, well, I don't have a place, but you've got to ask my landlord if he's got a place. You want to get there? I told him we were pregnant and hadn't needed an extra bed. He said, I'll build it for you. It's just, this is what I love about this game. Everyone can win. For me to make $1, I don't need to deprive someone else of $1.
It can be a win-win-win.
Yeah.
Right. I love that. There was a book that was written by Eric Gunderson. It was called Killing Sacred Cows. And I don't think it's like a well-known book, but it was a good book. And one of the things that it said kind of goes to your point is that he said in there that, and this changed my perspective about money. Money is just a receipt of value created. And when I started thinking of that as a receipt, something that somebody gives you in exchange for value that you created, instead of the opposite, a lot of times we think we lead with money. And we're just, hey, I want the money, instead of, or like, how do I make more money? How do I make more money? Instead of, how do I just create more value for everyone?
Right.
Then it shifts the game to money then just flows to you because money is the receipt that you get for creating value. And that's what you're talking about here.
I like that. There's also a British author called Roald Dahl. He's not with us anymore. He wrote lots of kids' stories and short stories, but he also wrote a novel called My Uncle Oswald. And he quotes his Uncle Oswald as saying that making money should fulfill 2 requirements. Firstly, he said, it should amuse you immensely. And secondly, it should give a lot of pleasure to those from whom you extract the loot. And when you think about it that way, despite the odd wording, if you enjoy what you're doing, it amuses you, and secondly, you give more value than you're charging.
Yes.
Then, what's wrong with that? It should become a joy rather than a burden. Let alone having to do something horrible in order to make money, robbing a bank or robbing an old lady crossing the street or an old man or whatever. That should be, no, it should give pleasure to those who willingly pay you because they're getting more value than they perceive they're paying you. And
one of the things I say all the time too is it's simple, not easy. You have to find something. It doesn't make any sense if I came to you and said, and knock on your door and I said, Dolf, I'm going to give you this $50 bill and all I want you to do is give me a $50 bill back. You'd be like, Well, it makes no sense. Why would I do that? It also doesn't make sense if I say, hey, I'm going to give you this, no matter how good of a salesman I am, if I say, hey, here's a $50 bill and all you have to do is give me $10 back. No, it doesn't make sense. But how easy is it if I say, hey, here's a $50 bill and, or sorry, I messed that one. Like, hey, if I give you $50 and you have to give me $100 back, like you're not going to do that deal. $50 and 10 you give me and you make $40, you're going to go, what's the catch?
Right.
And then I'll say, no, there's no catch. Actually, Janice down the street, she did it too. She found out it was a great deal. She made $40. And then eventually you're going to vet it out and then try it maybe. You maybe be a little weirded out, but then you're like, well, why is this guy doing it? That's just what business is. You've got to create so much value for somebody, and the real estate is no different, that it's a no-brainer for them to buy it at that price because the value is there.
Right.
The value is already there. So you're a master at creating value in real estate to take something that looks like a lemon, creating more value somehow by drawing it just blows my mind, a circle, a painted out circle for a helipad and changing $20 worth of paint into $2 million. That is incredible, but that's the idea. How can we retrain our mind to just think value, 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 and how do I increase the value of this property?
And it's one of those things where if you think it's not possible, then you won't look for those deals and it won't happen to you. And your belief that it's not possible will be validated because, look, I'm living proof. It's never happened to me. Whereas if your belief is, well, that's wacky, I wonder if I could ever do something like that, or I wonder if there's a variation. Maybe it's not a helipad, but a train station or whatever. If you believe it might be possible, you'll start looking for things like that. And then it will happen to you one day. And your belief that it's possible will be validated.
Yep.
That's why, people greater than me have said you become your dominant thoughts. So be very careful what you wish for. Be careful what you think about. Be careful what you focus on. Be careful whom you hang with.
Yes. I talk about it all the time, the reticular activating system in our brain, the RAS, right? What you focus on expands. If you look at a Tesla and you want to buy a Tesla, you're going to see more Teslas on the road. Why? Not because there's any more Teslas. It's because you're thinking about it. And so what you just said, I agree with 100%, because if you just shut off the idea that you can't go create $2 million worth of value by drawing a helipad, you're right, you won't, because you just shut off the whole possibility of that ever happening or in some way happening.
Right.
I love that because it is so true, because all we have to do is just train our mind to start thinking that way. The second we say, well, that's not possible, it is over. And I know so many people that are like that. In fact, a lot of my old friends used to think that way. The reason we're not friends anymore isn't because I don't like them. It's because we don't have much in common anymore. I can't stand talking to them anymore about all their limited beliefs and different things. I still love them. I just don't want to be around them that much.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
It does take guts to fire some of your friends.
Yeah.
It takes courage.
Yeah.
But sometimes you have to, because otherwise you'll be stuck.
You'll be stuck for sure.
No, it's so
Dolf, this has been great. Thank you so much. There's so many nuggets in here. You have something coming up here pretty soon. You want to tell everybody about it for my listeners? You have an event coming up. It's online, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It is online. It is March the 14th. And we are going to be sharing how you can find either residential real estate or commercial real estate or even businesses, that how you go about finding them. And then once you've found them, how do you vet them? How do you figure out, is this a good deal or not? Partially because we really want to identify the really good deals, but equally importantly, Eric, we want to avoid the lemons. We want to avoid buying something that we're then saddled with for 3 years and it turns out to kill our ability to buy a great deal, right? Then once we've figured out if it's a great deal, we have to know how to take it down. How do we settle on it? How do we own it? And that's an art in itself. We've got to negotiate finance for it. We might have to negotiate partners or equity share. So we go over all of that. And it's all so that you can end up either starting off your journey of acquiring real estate, because I believe with a passion, in case you haven't picked up on this yet, that real estate is not just a little bit better than other things or even a lot better. It's orders of magnitude better than these other investments for all the reasons we've touched on. You can do things to them to increase the value way beyond the cost of making that improvement. $20 to $2 million, $1,000 for a carport to $10,000 of value. There's no other investment I know of where you can do that. So we're going to explore that for beginners, but also for people who have an existing portfolio. If you own something already, we'll figure out what can you do to that to enhance it. Because if you were to come and listen to this event on March the 14th and you figure out a way of adding $50,000 to your existing portfolio, would that make it a horrible afternoon?
Yeah, it was going to be great. Why wouldn't you want to do that?
Right, exactly.
Right. So how do they learn about it? How do they join in?
You know, I've made it easy. I've got a link. It's dolflive.com/Eric in honor of you.
Oh, thank you.
It's Dolf. It's my name, DOLF. Live, L-I-V, so dolflive.com/Eric, and it's got all the details there, how you can join it. It's free, by the way. It's our gift. It's my way of trying to share what's out there so that people who are either haven't had the guts yet to take back can figure out if it is for them, whether they should have the courage to have that leap of faith, or people who've got an existing portfolio and they want to know, wow, is there anything I can do to my property to increase the value?
That is awesome. Guys, we'll make sure to put that link in the bio of this podcast episode so you can easily find it there. But if you're not doing anything on the 14th of March, be here at that. Do you know what time it is yet?
I believe it's 5 p.m. Pacific time.
Pacific time.
6 p.m.
Mountain Standard Time.
And, so we should be careful here. It'll be just after daylight saving kicks in. So to be accurate, it will be 5 p.m. Pacific's daylight time. So
that's great. If you work a 9 to 5, you'll be ready for the free event. So Thanks again so much for coming on the podcast. I learned some things today. I got inspired to go and think outside the box. You're amazing at that. I appreciate it so much. Thank you. And guys, if you got value from this episode, please share it. If you want to get involved in real estate, go to the event in March. Like, you're going to learn so much from this man. This is a man that you want to connect with, you want to network with. So again, appreciate you being here. Guys, we'll see you in the next episode. Thanks so much for listening.